Hi, Misha here. And I've already done a few different diecast model videos. First one looking at Japanese planes, second one looking at Russian MiGs, and now I thought I'd look at a few kind of radical, read crazy, planes from World War II from Nazi Germany. On the right we have the Henkel HE-162, the People's Plane. And we have, of course, the famous Messerschmitt ME.163, the first jet. And then on the left, we have what we're going to talk about in this video, the Messerschmitt ME.163. Now these models are from Oxford. Not a bad company considering the price. They're around 20 bucks each. They are ostensibly die cast. Not bad. Since these are 172 scale and kind of older designs, they're going to be smaller by necessity. And the main body is metal with a cockpit. Cockpits don't open on these, and their landing gear are permanently in the up position, although the gear on something like a 163 is kind of unique. One thing I will say with the Oxford, they do a lot of World War II, and I like their jets, but their prop planes, the propellers do not spin, so if you get one, just be aware of that. And they do come with a basic stand. So, yeah. The ME.163, and this is a B variant for what it's worth, was the world's first and really only rocket-powered aircraft, at least to go into actual production and see military use. And it actually set several records. For example, it was the first to exceed 1,000 kilometers per hour. Had a lot of height to climb records, things like that. This actually started off in 1937 in a program basically to look at militarizing various gliders. Early on they would try unpowered, just gliders. Then they would try using a couple of small prop piston engines. But then they would hit upon the idea for a rocket engine. Rocketry was a very new technology that came out around 1936. Originally, the work would be at Henkel in partnership with DFS. However, due to various problems, the lead designer requested it be moved to Messerschmitt, which happened in January of 1939. There was a working, at least to some extent, prototype, the HE-176, and this would be carried over to Messerschmitt. And in 1940, we would get the prototypical airframe here, and it would be paired with a rocket motor. And then the first test flights would occur in 1941 throughout really most of that year. This was a radically different plane than what came before. The original ME.163A was a kind of pre-production craft. It pioneered the use of a bi-propellant engine. It used C-Stoff with T-Stoff as an oxidizer for burning, I mean, you can get into the chemical formulas of each, but really all you need to know is both were highly corrosive, highly toxic, and highly exploding. So much so that lots of safety had to be taken when fueling these up. 2 different tanker trucks were used. They weren't allowed on the airfield at the same time, and still yet accidents happened. I mean, and obviously the fuel tanks were in the whole craft. So a pilot was just sitting on toxic corrosive liquid. Interestingly, this did not have traditional landing gear. Originally, it would have, well, it had a carriage that it would take off with and then jettison. And then it would essentially rocket up very quickly to altitude and then fly back down and then usually be unpowered. It only had about enough propellant, enough rocket fuel for about 7.5 minutes of burn. And it could go very fast. 500 miles an hour wasn't unheard of. And it could get very high, up to about 39,000 feet. The problem there was the cockpit was not pressurized, and so the pilot had to endure that. He did have an oxygen bottle, but that was it. So it would just zoom up and then kind of fall back to Earth. The idea was it would pass bomber. It was designed as an interceptor, a short-range interceptor. It would attack bombers, and they could have 2 to 4 passes depending on the skill of the pilot and whatnot. After the test with the 163A, the 163B would start to be developed in late 1941, and it would incorporate several updates. Many had to do with just, streamlining it for mass production. But it did have a better undercarriage. It had a small little retractable gear in the back. It had a retractable landing skid in the middle. It had an updated engine. One change they did, the engine could now be throttled. This was good for control and also even conserving fuel sometimes, but it also decreased reliability. Early production planes would have two 20 millimeter cannons with 100 rounds each, but most of the production models would have two 30 millimeter cannons with 60 rounds each. Sounds like a good idea to go to a larger cannon, especially when you only have a brief window to attack something, but the problem was the 30 millimeter cannons used had a relatively low cyclic rate and relatively slow moving projectiles. So it's kind of a trade-off. This thing is obviously longer, or wider than it is long. It's about 18.5 feet long and about 30.5 feet wide with a very large wing, as you see. Again, it started off as a glider, and even then, once its engine ran out, it was still a glider, so it shows. But yeah, these would take off using their carriage, they would jettison it, they would fly up, intercept the bombers, and then glide back down, landing the best they could. They only had one shot at it, so better make it a good one. And then they were basically just sitting on the ground, unpowered, until a tow truck, essentially literally a farm tractor, could come and hitch them up and haul them back. And while this was a very fast, very small, even quite maneuverable and agile little plane, American pilots quickly learned its shortcomings and basically would just hold it off and then attack it once it ran out of thrust or landed on the ground, where it was literally a sitting duck. Because of the radical nature of this craft, it actually took through 1942 and 43 for it to really get into the B model to go into production. In fact, it would be manufactured by Junkers because Messerschmitt was just overloaded. And really, it wasn't just made at one factory. Manufacturing for these was spread out, including underground factories, which became more common throughout the war. So long story short, these really didn't start to appear in the field until 1944. They would build about 400, but considering they were planning to make thousands as kind of a ring defense type interceptor around air bases and other vital targets, it was well short of the goal. And of course, they didn't always have fuel for these. The thing is, this had such a high maintenance and all that. I mean, they had to be thoroughly washed and cleaned after every flight. They had to do the carriage, yada yada. Just a lot could go wrong. Really, amazingly though, this had a pretty good safety record, at least in the air. This was named the Komet, which is a very apt name in oh so many ways for this aircraft. Oh, I didn't mention, it had a lead-acid battery to provide power, but it was a very short duration battery, 5, 10, 15 minutes. So it also had a little turbine in the front, which when it was flying would spin and produce additional power while in flight. These had a few aerial victories, but not many. Certainly not enough to warrant all the time and resources that went into making them. They would only shoot down a couple of dozen aircraft, mostly bombers, and in turn, they would lose 9 to 12 ME.163s in the air. Now, on the ground, obviously, yeah. Essentially, once the ME.262 was maturing, they quickly lost attention for the 163. To that end, by early 1945, most of the squadrons of these that were still in existence were disbanded and the pilots transferred to the new jet fighters. And that was pretty much it. Now, of course, as with most German technology, many of these were captured by the Allies and tested in the UK, Soviet Union, and the USA. And to some extent would influence some so-called X-planes, but this really was the only production rocket fighter in a military sense. A jet was just a much more practical thing for oh so many reasons. But yeah, just thought we would talk about this. It's not a jet, but it is kind of a immediate forerunner of jets. And just an interesting plane and a neat little model from Oxford here, considering the money. You hear it's metal. The flap is, well, can't decide if that's metal or plastic, honestly. Of course, the tube and hook are plastic. But yeah, for what it is, it's a neat little model. Kind of glad, because it'd be a little much to have something this small and, you know, have it in the Hobby Master line. Be kind of feel a bit like a rip. I mean, they could have, you know, do the little disposable undercarriage and some other things to make it a little better, but a lot of times with World War II stuff, if they want to do a more ornate model, they'll go to 1/48 scale, and I don't do the 1/48, so I'm happy there's at least a 1/72 as a representative piece for the old collection. Well, folks, that's about it for this one. Pretty, honestly, it was in development much longer than it was in military service. But neat, nonetheless, and very innovative, if nothing else. Well, in the next part, we'll get on to the 262 and the 162. So, check back soon for those. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.